We do have closed captioning available within Zoom, and you can find that down at the bottom of your screen in the More options. So let's go to the next slide. So I'm Amy Miracle. I'm a research scientist at the Alcohol Research Group in the Public Health Institute. I co-lead the I-STARR project with Dr. Carm Misson, who's a professor of psychiatry in the School of Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, or UCSF. The team also includes co-investigators Sarah Zemore and Lenny Jason, biostatisticians Mina Subbaraman and Libo Lee, and we also have communication support from Diane Schmidt. The team's project coordinator is Quinoja Capitani. Let's go to the next slide. So the I-STARR project activities are guided by an absolutely amazing 17-member advisory board comprised of a diverse group of leaders from across the country. So our advisory board members represent recovery and recovery housing leaders, treatment providers and payers, national policy advocates, as well as researchers and educators. Actually, we'll be hearing from one of these amazing board members today. Let's go to the next slide. So let me tell you about today's presenter, Mr. Aaron Williams. So Aaron is a senior advisor at the National Council for Mental Wellbeing and has more than 18 years of experience providing training and technical assistance in mental health and substance use services, with an emphasis on substance use treatment and prevention, workforce development, implementation of evidence-based practices in clinical settings. So he's written and contributed to a number of articles and reports on drug misuse, primary care and substance use integration, recovery housing, screening, brief intervention, referral to treatment, mental health and primary care integration, workforce development of mental health and substance use providers, and implementation of medication assisted treatment services, or MAT services. So Aaron holds a bachelor's degree in psychology from Morehouse College, a master's degree in psychology from the Catholic University of America, and a certificate in strategic management from the Georgetown University School of Communication or Continuing Studies. He's currently a member of the American Psychological Association's Society of Addiction Psychology and the Association for Multidisciplinary Education and Research in Substance Use and Addiction. I feel very honored that this is the second NIH-funded project on which I've had the opportunity to collaborate with Aaron. He's a true asset in the field of recovery housing. So without further delay, let's turn the presentation over to Aaron to get things started on the topic of new horizons and opportunities for recovery housing. Aaron, passing it off to you.
All right, thank you, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. Hi, everyone. I am happy to be here today to talk about a subject that I think over the last 7 to 10 years has become near and dear to my heart in the context of substance use, which was something I was already passionate about. So if we go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about sort of what we're going to do today. So really, as a part of this conversation, I thought it was important to maybe set the stage and give a little bit of context around sort of where we are now, particularly as it relates to substance use. I'll talk a little bit about some, trends and what's happening, particularly around recovery housing, but also I'll go into a little bit about the federal policy landscape related to recovery housing sort of currently. I think there are, you know, not as frequent conversations about this as I would like to see about sort of where we are at the federal level. Lots of things are happening, certainly at the state and local level, but wanted to sort of tap in to kind of give some perspective about where we are now and sort of what that means long term. I'll talk a little bit about what some of those gaps we see and we think about in recovery housing infrastructure, what that looks like. Many of you are, either providing services now or are thinking about providing services or trying to get people into services, working with potential providers or operators in your own area. So talking a little bit about what some of those concerns are, and then, some ideas about, what might be the path forward or what's important for us to be thinking about. Um, One of the things I've had the pleasure of having conversations with some of the, giants in the field, including Amy and others that are a part of the board for I-STARR, and really thinking about what might be either some new opportunities or what are the things that we need to in some ways keep doing and enhancing where we're doing a good job sort of building infrastructure and we need to keep going. So I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. um, as I go through this, what I'll also talk about is my current organization, the National Council for Mental Well-Being, and our history working around recovery housing and sort of advocating for recovery housing at both the local and federal level. So it's something I think that many folks may not be aware of in terms of our work. So I'll cover a bit of that as we move forward. And then hopefully we'll have some time at the end. I'll talk about some resources that are developed by my organization as well as others, and then maybe get into some questions. I'm curious to what others are seeing as they are engaged in this work and as they are trying to move recovery housing forward in ways that they know how. So hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. Feel free to drop those questions in the chat. If something pops up that's emergent, feel free to, the team here at I-STARR can stop me and I can answer that, or we can hold most until the end. Either is sort of fine by me. All right, so why don't we kind of dive into this conversation a little bit and go to the next slide. All right, so one of the things I wanted to do, I don't know if the audience is sort of familiar with my organization, the National Council of Mental Well-Being. If that name does not ring a bell, it could be because about, I guess, 4 years ago now, at some point during COVID, we actually changed our name from the National Council for Community Behavioral Health. We decided to engage in this name change because, as we thought about our work in the mental health space, one of the things that kept coming up was this idea of mental well-being. So more than just advocating for addiction treatment providers or mental health providers, but actually focusing on this idea of long-term mental well-being. As a part of our mantra, we believe that mental health and mental well-being is achievable for everyone, including individuals living with or recovering from a mental health or substance use challenge. And we sort of try to live by that credo, and a lot of our advocacy work and also educational opportunities are focused on that. Some years ago, one of our previous CEOs, Linda Rosenberg, really pushed forward the idea that it was not enough for us to simply go up to Capitol Hill, figure out what was going on, advocate for our interests, and then report back to our members. The idea she put forward was that we ought to be thinking about preparing the field for what's coming. And so we have moved forward with that. So we have lots of educational opportunities, webinars, resources, other grants and other opportunities that I'll talk a little bit more about later. So we really are trying to live that mantra of educating the field. Next slide. All right, so what I want to do now is just talk a little bit about, where we are, particularly from a substance use perspective. I think it's always good to start some of these conversations with a bit of a lay of the land and sort of understanding exactly where we are. I think, many of us understand that, substance use is certainly still very much a significant public health issue in the U.S. We are all, who are working in the field, sort of living through that. But in terms of the latest data, again, this is data from the National Survey of Drug Use and Health, which is the largest mechanism by which the government really collects data related to substance use. The survey goes out to about 60 to 70,000 people across the country about substance use. And, at this point, we have about 48.4 million people who have had a substance use disorder within the last year. So a significant number of people who are struggling with some sort of substance use challenge. We've had, in terms of people aged 12 and older, about 73.6 million people have used an illicit drug in the past year. We also have significant numbers of people who are dying related to their substance use. I think many of us understand that over the last decade, we have been in I guess, opioid epidemic from a public health perspective. We've seen numbers skyrocket. They are beginning to come down. A lot of that is due to both prescription opiates and synthetic opiates of late, including fentanyl. The risk of death is quite significant, in sort of our times that we live in now. So as of 2024, CDC data talks about this as being about 80,000 people died of a drug overdose in 2024. The bulk of that is due to opioid related use. So that's down considerably from previous years, but still a substantial number of people who are dying related to substance use. Also, if we think about alcohol, which again is one of the legal substance and one of the more common substances that people use. Data from CDC talks about, I think the last data available in 2022 says there are about 105,000 alcohol-related deaths in the United States. So, we have significant death, not to mention the morbidity and mortality related to substance use that is still, very much a public health problem and certainly necessitates lots of actions to address it. And we'll talk more about that shortly. Next slide. One of the things that's been fascinating to watch over time is sort of the evolution of our ability to really understand sort of what's happening in the country related to substance use. And one of those, I think, steps forward was, I think it was in 2020 or 2021 when we first started looking at this, was the addition of questions on the National Survey of Drug Use and Health related to recovery. We wanted to better understand not just how many people are using or having challenges with substances, but how many people consider themselves to be in recovery from substance use. We wanted to better understand the power of recovery, better understand, what the lay of the land looks like, how many people have moved forward and, how that is, playing out for them long term. So when we look at this data again from 2024, adults age 18 or older, you have 31 million, 0.7 million said that they ever had problems with substance use, and 23.5 million who say they have recovered or are in some form of recovery from substance use. If you look at mental health conditions, you see sort of even greater effects in some way. 67 million people say they had some level of problem, and 45 million who say that they are in recovery or have recovered from a mental health challenge. I think this is significant. One is to understand how people understand this idea of recovery, to understand that recovery works, that there are mechanisms and things that can assist people on their journey towards recovery, and really help us as we think about how to move forward and better address substance use, and also mobilizing the power of people with lived and living experience. Next slide. So, as I think about all of this, I think there are a few things that sort of come to mind in terms of this conversation. When we think about kind of the broader landscape, still lots of significant public health challenges around, substance use. Certainly mental health as well, but around substance use in general. And as a part of that conversation, states, the federal government, all of us are engaged in these conversations about how to better, allocate resources. Funders, funding is tight. I think as all of us understand, there are finite resources, inflation, all sorts of things that are really challenging our ability to get resources to people. And decision makers are left trying to make real decisions about what should be funded, what should not be funded, thinking about ways in which they need to optimize care. And I think a lot of that plays into our larger conversation here about evidence-based practices, things that are have good evidence and should be utilized in broader ways. And I think recovery housing is a big part of that conversation. So when we think about just recovery support services, there's a larger and growing body of research about the effectiveness of recovery support services in helping to address substance use challenges. Yet these services are often underfunded and underutilized, which is a huge issue in our field. I think in the last couple years, and I'll talk a little bit later about this, there have been some direct studies about this. There was a study optimizing recovery that looked at how states were funding recovery support services. I think some interesting things came out of that. Um, as we think about this further, peer support is a growing part of our service delivery, particularly in integrated settings. And a question becomes, how do we better fund this and how do we capitalize on these things going forward? Next slide. All right, so as part of this conversation, I just want to, begin to level set about sort of how we think about these things, right? Um, in 2016, the Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, commissioned the first ever Surgeon General's report on substance use. It is a comprehensive document, about as comprehensive as we've seen. It's still, I think, even today, it's a little older. There have been some advances, but still quite relevant to the conversation now. So if you've not seen that document, I would encourage you to take a look at it. It does a few things, I think move us forward. One is it has a different conversation, particularly around language and how we talk about describing substance use disorders. Moves us away from terms like substance abuse and into conversations around substance use. One of the things that I think is important for this conversation is that it, in some ways, codifies a substance use disorder treatment service continuum of care. It really sort of formally looks at these components and these services that essentially ought to be available for people to both prevent, identify, and also treat substance use. And on the screen here, you have sort of how they have sort of carved this out. And I think it's a good way to think about service delivery for substance use. So you have these enhancing health services, which are really things that are designed to promote both physical and mental well-being. So thinking about health fairs and other sort of access to broad sort of healthcare and sort of health screenings and sort of messages around prevention. Then you have primary prevention activities, which are things that you probably know and aware of, like, marketing campaigns and other campaigns designed specifically to reduce substance use. So even just say no campaigns or reducing drinking campaigns or even environmental strategies. So, taxes on alcohol, tobacco use. Those are sort of primary prevention strategies. And then we also have these sort of early intervention strategies really designed to identify substance use much earlier in the course, and provide people with what I talk about is the right service at the right time in the right way. As a part of that, you also get these sort of secondary prevention activities. So looking at all of these services really designed to meet people where they are and provide appropriate services, in those moments. We think about things like expert screening, brief intervention, referral to treatment, and other interventions like that. You also have what we all sort of know in terms of sort of formal treatment. So people going to outpatient programs, going to therapy, group therapy, individual therapy, also including medications for addiction treatment as a part of our work, and certainly as a part of the work here, as a part of this. And then we also have sort of formally included in this is the idea of recovery supports. Recovery supports really in some ways and peer support can be woven into almost all of these different categories. But I really like to highlight it here in this space. So really is looking at this idea of what kinds of services are needed, not just to get someone to discontinue use or reduce use, but move them towards long-term recovery, re-engagement with society, re-engagement with family, friends, meaningful work, hobbies, all of those things. What are those supports? And included in that is recovery housing. There are lots of supports there that are evidence-based, that really help facilitate what we all want is that long-term recovery. And recovery housing is a big component of that. And so again, I think this is important for us to think about this in this way. Recovery housing isn't something that is sort of over there or sort of outside of our regular treatment system in a way. If we're thinking about this idea of long-term recovery, it is one of the, I think, important sorts of recovery supports and other things we ought to be thinking about for those who need it. So really, pulling all of that into how we think about treatment services. Next slide. So again, when we think about, again, peer recovery support services, you're really talking about the ability and resources to help people initiate, stabilize, and sustain recovery. We're not talking about clinical work. It's not clinical sort of care. It's something, in some ways broader and deeper than that. Mutual aid and 12 step is sort of distinct even in some ways from that. And you can provide it in a host of settings. Use of peers and people with lived and living experience can, permeate all sorts of settings, healthcare settings, treatment settings, public health settings, and really provide, I think, meaningful services and work to help people move forward. So as we think about, the power of sort of peer support, embedded in this idea of recovery housing is sort of this idea of the benefits and power of peer support. Next slide. So again, as we think about this, again, there are a number of things that really are out there. This is just kind of listing some of these here. There's certainly mutual help organizations, lots of peer-based recovery support services. RCOs, recovery community organizations, looking at, recovery supports even in educational settings, sober dorms, healthcare settings. And also, again, critical component of this is recovery housing and sober living environments. This is a part of the continuum, and I'll talk in a second about, some of the evidence base here, and we really ought to be, thinking about the expansion of these services in meaningful ways. Next slide. All right, so when we think about recovery housing, I think in some ways I would say the best way to put it, sort of the train is, or the horse is sort of left the barn in terms of data around recovery housing and its benefits. The data is there. One of the things I remember actually there was I think it was in Psychiatric News, about in 2014, they did something in coordination with SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, called Assessing the Evidence. And one of the things they did was they looked at a host of evidence-based practices that people thought were beneficial, particularly to substance use treatment. The things that sort of came out in that were very helpful were, the medications for addiction treatment. So opioid use medications, methadone, buprenorphine, naltrexone. But also what came out and rated very well as a part of that was recovery housing, and other things that were components of this. So, there has been sort of a trend of looking at the evidence related to recovery housing, and there is good evidence that recovery housing is associated with decreased substance use, reduced likelihood of return to use, lower incarceration rates, higher income, increased employment, improved family relationships. So for those that need it, this is something that we should be thinking about as a beneficial tool and option. Next slide. So I'll talk a little bit here about kind of where we are. So the precursor to some of the I-STARR work, the I-STARR project, talks about there being at a minimum of 10,908 distinct recovery residences operating in all 50 states, including the District of Columbia. There's other data that talks about even upwards of about 17,000 recovery residences, across the country, operating in at least, 30% of all counties in the United States. And recovery housing really is one of the most widely available support infrastructures. I say that with a bit of a caveat, and I'll get to in my next slide. There also has been lots of progress in terms of, how we understand recovery housing. Recovery housing is now a part of the latest update to ASAM criteria. So really thinking about that as a part of the system of care in a meaningful way. And also, again, growing research and support, which, I-STARR and I-STARR are really a part of, about the value of recovery housing. Next slide. So going back to that caveat, those are pretty big numbers in terms of recovery housing, recovery residences across the country. However, many communities across the country still have very limited to no recovery housing available. There are across the country when I've gone to do a lot of TA, one of the biggest challenges in doing some of the recovery work is like, hey, we don't really have much recovery housing here. We're trying to figure out where we can put people. We have limited bed space available. We only have a couple operators. Their houses are already always full. So I hear that refrain across the country quite a lot. Also, as we think about this, going back to some of my earlier comments, funding for recovery housing is still sort of scattershot across the country. So the limited, it's often short term. There are some good funding models that we can talk about. that seem to work, but one of the biggest barriers is that most models are not sort of the sustained long-term models that I think all of us would like. And I think the evidence for recovery housing really um, sort of demands in some way in terms of its benefit for people who need it. There's still lots of stigma and still a need for operator education. That remains a challenge on a lot of levels. And still, there are some places who are doing some good job in thinking about this and working through those things. There are lots of programs, such as this one, that are beginning to move the needle forward in many ways, but it still remains a bit of a challenge there. Also, in lots of my conversations with others in the field, there still is a great need for more specialty recovery residences, dealing with special populations, and really, making sure that we have residents that deal with the unique needs of individuals and groups that we serve. So, still some work there in terms of addressing those kinds of things. Next slide. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about what's happening with the at the federal level. So again, we are a federal, we are an advocacy organization, the National Council on Mental Wellbeing. Our members are substance use treatment and mental health organizations across the country. We have members in all 50 states, and we really help them advocate typically for funds, to continue to do the important and meaningful work they're doing across the country. And as a part of that conversation, lots of different federal initiatives come up, and things that we sort of, decide to support or not. And we have over the last few years, been really paying attention to the issue of recovery housing. And one of the things that has come up is sort of in the last few years, the thing that's sort of been moving at the federal level has been the Support Act, which includes some provisions related to recovery housing. For those who don't know, the Support Act is a fairly large act that was first passed in 2018, and actually was reauthorized this year, actually a couple months ago. Interestingly enough, we were getting ready for our Hill Day in October, and we were going to bring up reauthorization of the Support Act, but in the interim, it actually was reauthorized. So that was a very good win, I think, for the field. Part of what the Support Act does is it provides resources for individuals who reenter the workplace, who are in recovery, getting back into the workplace. It reauthorizes a number of programs to help moms and babies with alcohol and other substance use disorders. It also, for this discussion, authorized the Recovery Housing Program, which I'll talk about in a second, to provide transitional housing for people recovering from substance use disorders. It reauthorizes comprehensive opioid recovery centers that provide full spectrum services, and does a good job, I think, in providing resources to help addiction medicine program providers, know more about substance use, and really enter the workforce with broader capacity and abilities to work, particularly around issues of recovery. So the Support Act is a good win. There certainly are, lots of other things I think, we could do at the federal level and hope gets done. Certainly, there's been some changes in the administration, and we're sort of, I think, in a bit of a holding pattern to see kind of what their long-term vision may be, or particularly around substance use. I think we see bits and pieces here and there, but I think we're sort of still in kind of a wait and see mode about sort of where things really go. Next slide. So the Recovery Housing Program really is sort of, in some ways, a broad pilot program that covered 25 states and the District of Columbia, to fund recovery housing and looking at costs like public facilities, rent, utilities, construction. And it's administered by HUD. and provides grants for those states, to do this work to kind of put together some of the structures there on the ground and, apply for the funds and sort of move those things forward. In terms of kind of where we are now, um, you know, I think we're in sort of an uncertain space in terms of, where the program will go long term. Certainly things are still happening in lots of places on the ground that I think are generally positive. We are still again in wait and see mode in terms of the administration and where they go with some of their shifts, and particularly in their conversation around homelessness and looking at things like work requirements, looking more at moving away from permanent supportive housing to more transitional housing and other sorts of pieces. Again, we're still, I think, in a bit of wait and see mode as we think about that. But again, I think there are some good things happening on the ground in many of these places. Work is being done, I think, from a you know advocacy lens. Thinking about how we can continue to push and advocate. That programs like this continue and that they are funded and any gaps in funding are limited or non-existent. I think that's where we need to be thinking. It goes to the next slide where we talk a little bit more about sort of what else is on the horizon at the federal level and sort of what's still kind of out there. One of the things that I talked about, the recovery housing program, there are champions at the federal level in the House and Senate for recovery housing, and a lot of this work. So it is still there, and people are still looking at lots of things related to this. One thing that comes up is the Start Housing Act, again, which is a bipartisan bill, which actually was looking to expand the recovery housing program to all states and removing the current limit. So that certainly was out there. The Safe Shores Act, which is a bit of a similar kind of act, but it's kind of sort of an expansion in some ways. Again, seeks to reauthorize and improve the recovery housing program, increasing funding, giving more flexibility to the states, and encouraging the use of facilities that follow best practices. Again, moving more into this idea of some standardization. There's still a lot of work out here around the Second Chance Act reauthorization that we are still thinking about, passed in 2025, recently. So looking for the House and sort of moving all of these things forward. Again, providing more resources for people post-incarceration, which I know and for people working in the field understand it is a critical point for people, particularly with substance use disorders, coming out of locked environments, integrating back into the community, in a very a place where I think recovery housing could be quite beneficial for people. So looking at reentry programs and others. And also, still sort of out there, and I guess kind of floating around in some form, the Excellence in Recovery Housing Act, which has been around for a bit of a while, and it is, really in many ways sort of pushes SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, to, think about developing more guidelines for states particularly around recovery housing, and also providing broader sort of grants for implementation. So again, looking at, setting some broader standards and rules of the road. There are, lots of concerns, in the field about, for lack of a better term, rogue providers and other things, or states that have, programs that might, on paper, but, in terms of implementation are sort of, really inconsistent with what we would say many of the goals of recovery housing are in some ways. So really, helping or looking at SAMHSA to really help us as, move this forward and create some broader rules of the road. So that's still, out there sort of floating around in some form as well. So again, there is some motion here there are people thinking about recovery housing as a part of broader overall proposals around, um, changes around substance use policy. One thing I might add is for a number of years, arguably the last decade or so, the National Council for Mental Wellbeing has championed the idea of certified community behavioral health centers, or CCBHCs. And these are really comprehensive mental health and substance use treatment organizations that provide an array of services and have sort of expanded capacity and funding to do so. And many of them, are, looking to, work with and sort of partner with recovery housing operators. So again, it's another, space and place that we should think about in terms of, how do we move our work forward? How do we expand services and really meet the needs on the ground in many places? Next slide. All right. So I think I talked about this a little bit earlier. At the National Council, we have done a lot of work over the last few years related to recovery housing. Really goes back, I think, close to about 2016, maybe even a little bit earlier. One of my former bosses and colleagues, even to this day, Tom Hill, really sort of championed the idea of recovery housing and the work that was happening around recovery housing. One of the things that we did, I think, initially was we created a toolkit, around a state policy guide, that really laid sort of a blueprint and foundation for how states might want to think about yeah, supporting recovery housing. That document is scattered across the internet somewhere. I think we have updated that document a couple times. I want to say the last version may be around 2023 or 2024. But again, I think it's still a very good document that provides, I think, some guidance and some good ideas around how states might want to think about supporting recovery housing. After that, we also sort of stayed with this conversation and looked and in 2021 did a national convening technical expert panel where for over the course of sort of 2 half days via Zoom, we brought together all of the sort of experts and policymakers in the as it relates to that. We took that and we put that into a technical assistance report, which I think is linked here and it was graciously put into the chat or is being put into the chat. And that document, interesting enough, there are a few things that have been implemented in the document, so that's actually a positive. But there are, I think, a number of good ideas and things that we ought to be thinking about related to recovery housing that are in that document are still very relevant to where we are today. We also, engaged through funding from the Opioid Response Network and looking at how recovery residences can adapt and support people who are using medications to assist with their treatment and recovery. And we put out sort of a guide, that I think is very helpful to really having that conversation and really engaging in that provider education to understand, that, the use of medications is not inconsistent with, your goals of recovery housing. And so that is also available. We also in 2023, we at our NatCon conference, our sort of largest behavioral health conference, had a policy implementation convening where we looked at um, had a number of SSAs coming from all the states, single state authorities, people who ran their substance use services, and come in and talk about state policy around implementation of and moving recovery housing forward. We did another presentation at NatCon in 2024. Myself, Dave Sheridan, and others from Permanent Supportive Housing, talked about a lot of conversations related to recovery housing and permanent supportive housing, what that looks like going forward. And our latest sort of document, which is a document that's available now around recovery housing and transitional age youth. This is a critical point in time for some people, 18 to 25, where service delivery can sort of disappear in some ways. They age out of some things, but maybe very young for other things. So how do you support people during these transition, particularly as it relates to recovery housing or supportive housing? So this is a toolkit that kind of road maps you through some evidence-based practices that are happening out in the world today, and moves you forward through that. All right, next slide. Sorry. Oh, so I want to kind of close a little bit here and just talk a bit about sort of what's next in some ways. I think from where we were, recovery housing has made substantial progress in terms of really being seen as an important part of the treatment and recovery continuum. I think now we have to ensure that the money follows that. So looking at how we can help, policymakers, administrators, others, think about optimizing funding. There's some documents that were done by the Peer Recovery Center of Excellence that we actually worked on that talk about these ideas of recovery consciousness and looking at how states can optimize how they fund things in terms of what they're looking for. So I think there's some ways to think through this, but we really want to make sure that the funding sort of matches the need and the value of recovery housing. Continued research on the sort of growing body of evidence. There was a meta-analysis, I think, in 2025, Corey Villicent and John Kelly and others were looking at sort of other studies related to recovery housing and the benefits. So again, the evidence base is continuing to, I think, grow. But we really want to be able to look at some of the nuances of recovery housing, beginning to think about some of these broader conversations. Part of the things I think about is, recovery housing and its benefits to broader communities, not just individuals. Does crime go down? Do the other things go down where recovery houses and residents are present? I think there's some work in those areas that's been done, but certainly more can sort of expand and really help make the case for that. Also, as we think about, helping recovery housing sort of meet its full potential, we do need to continue to expand and grow, the operators of recovery residences. How do we get more people interested, more people from broader cross sections of the country interested in it? How do we really meet the needs and demands of the field and of the broader population in that way? And then also, again, greater focus on not just funding, but sustainable long-term funding, right? So I think that is one of the biggest things. So grant programs are great, but how do we begin to sustain this, even through third-party payers, other long-term commitments, that really push recovery housing forward in a sustainable way. So those are kind of the big ticket items I see for the future. I tend to be pretty optimistic about sort of where we're going and where we're headed. The challenges are there, but I don't think we're far away from our goals. Certainly, I think there'll be headwinds. As always, I think there is a wait and see sort of a conversation about where we are with this particular administration and what that means in terms of what happens when we get to see or they roll out more of their larger kind of policy ideas around recovery and recovery housing. But again, I'm still very optimistic that a lot of the ground that we have made will continue. So, next slide. Okay. So here, these are just a number of resources that I think might be useful to people. And certainly, I think they've been quite good. You see the Optimizing Recovery Funding document I talked about earlier has some really good information about how states actually fund recovery and recovery support services that it might be of interest to people. Opioid Response Network, I highly recommend them. If you need anything, you have TA requests, other things, they're a wealth of information, lots of consultants and other partners that are a part of that. So, and obviously, Oxford House and NAR, really being, the keepers of the standard as it relates to recovery housing in lots of ways. Certainly, if you are interested in recovery housing or need other assistance, I really would, talk with them as well. So I will stop there and see if there are other questions or comments. I think there are a few in the chat, it looks like.
Wow, Aaron, that was fantastic. What an amazing presentation. Just an amazing overview of the substance use treatment continuum, where recovery housing fits in that continuum. And I really appreciated the emphasis on the policy environment and the policy supporting recovery housing. So at this point, I do want to turn things over for discussion. There have been questions pop up in the chat. Feel free to drop more. Also, feel free to unmute yourselves if there's a spare moment. Starting with the question that we got early on in the chat. So this came from Courtney Boyce. And Courtney, if you're here, feel free to chime in. But she had a question about opioid settlement funds. Have you been hearing much about that and how that's being used for recovery housing?
So it's interesting. So I guess there are two ways I'll answer this. So yes, I think in some states have in large ways sort of made lots of decisions already about opioid settlement funds, and they've put forward all of their commissions and done all of their due diligence. And I think some states have looked at trying to fund and sort of broaden their recovery housing portfolios related to that using settlement funds. There is a lot of interest across the country, just as I have seen, doing sort of consulting and technical assistance about broadening recovery support services in general and using opioid settlement funds to do that. So again, I think there's some good ideas and some things that are happening. But also, as with other things, that money sort of eventually dries up in some ways. So you don't have the kind of sustainability that I think we would like. But, there could be some good ideas that come out of it. I did read, I guess that's last week in the newspaper. I guess the other case against the Sacklers is going to be settled. I don't know if that means that there will be sort of a secondary subset of funding that may go to the states in some other opioid settlement or not. Or maybe that's more to individuals, but I guess that could be a possibility as well. So yes, I think there's some things happening, some positive things in that space. So that is um, I think a good thing. My only caveat, and I think it's a worry that we all have, is, as states begin to, have budget shortfalls and things begin to dry up, will states sort of maintain their commitments to make sure that these resources are being allocated to those treatment and recovery support services and not sort of being redirected in any way. But so far I think it's moving as we would think it would.
So, Aaron, on the topic of funding streams, so you mentioned funding streams through the Support Act, which I'm guessing is pushed out through the state SSAs um, and the block grants. But you also mentioned funding from HUD. And I was wondering if you could talk about differences in these streams as it pertains to recovery housing. Are they equal? Do they kind of focus on different things? And we've also had questions in the chat regarding housing first versus traditional recovery housing and how those reconcile. So I wonder if you could tackle those questions.
Let me just start, I guess, with the funding stream. So um, it, my answer will be a bit of a I'm not sure, but I'll give some details to that. So part of there are a couple things I think here is as these streams sort of move forward, a lot of, Congress can direct them to be sort of put forward in a particular way. Then, as we sort of understand, those agencies in which the funds are sort of pushed through have sort of administrative and sort of implementation rules and policies that they sort of put forward. And a lot of that is contingent on sort of what the point of view is of the executive branch. So, I think there is some wiggle room here in terms of how some of these things will be pushed forward. I don't really know fully in terms of, what, if any, differences there will be. Certainly, I think most of us have seen some of the inklings about the change in how the current administration views homelessness and housing in general. And I certainly do think that could have some effect on if, as funds go forward, if they go forward, there may be some changes. One of the big things I think is sort of leaking into this conversation is the idea of work requirements. And that's certainly something that the administration has signaled that well, could be a part of any and all sort of conversations around housing. So again, I think we're in wait and see mode about those things, but I certainly think that, the point of view of the executive branch sort of has a lot to say about how that, will eventually shake out. And in terms of, so it's interesting. I'm glad the question came up related to recovery housing and housing first. I guess it was about a year or 2 years ago now. Was at a meeting at SAMHSA where they brought together people who were in sort of the recovery housing space with people who were in the housing first space. Certainly, I think. Over time, we have seen some tension between the models. But I think, looking more broadly at it, we understand, I think, that there's value in both, and that it exists in sort of a broad continuum of services. But during that conversation, one of the things that became clear, and it was, facilitated by SAMHSA, and there is I think, a report floating around somewhere on the internet, from that meeting. One of the things that the group was in very much agreement about was the need for peer respite services, and that was really sort of a broad gap in the service delivery model that everybody sort of believed needed to be funded and or supported. So I think there are lots of I think challenges remain, but I think there are broad conversations around this that are happening, and I think they're beginning to be far more positive than they were. Understanding these as um, services that are essential and sort of exist as a part of a continuum of services and care for people. Again, this idea of meeting people at the right place at the right time, with the right service. Now, again, I have lots of caveats, and I'll just, sort of say them. Um, we also do see, um, again, inklings from this administration around, housing first, around the idea of housing first models, and sort of, we may begin to see again moves towards some temporary supportive housing, or moves towards work requirements and other things as sort of mitigators of some of these services. So again, there's not enough to say definitively in some ways. I think we're still kind of in wait and see mode, but that's also out there as well.
Wonderful. So, guys, I really hate to wrap up this great discussion that we're having, but I do want to give you a heads up about some things coming up at the I-STARR project. And I just want to effusively thank Aaron for your generosity, your kindness. I wish we had more time with you. Thank you for letting us put your email in the chat because I know that folks had lots of questions we didn't get to. So feel free to connect with Erin offline. Next month, we'll be back with another I-STARR webinar. We're actually going to be hearing from one of our I-STARR pilot study directors, Aditi Tarfa, who's going to be talking about the connection between mobile pharmacies and recovery housing. So we hope to see everyone back for that webinar. We also have a training series online. I encourage you to go to our website to learn about all of the webinars, past and future, that we've scheduled all the way through June, and to register for any and all of them, if you so choose. I've also listed on this slide ways that you can follow the I-STARR project through social media. Again, feel free to reach out to us if you have questions, if you want to learn more about our training series, which is another cool thing that we do with the I-STARR project. But again, I hope to see you back here next month, and we'll hear more about recovery housing. Thank you so much, Erin, for your time and for this amazing webinar. Enjoy the rest of your day, folks.
All right. Thank you all. Appreciate it. Thank you.